I work as a receptionist in a large and busy hospital in the city center. It is not a quiet place, especially at night, when the movement decreases, but the tension seems to increase. That particular night, I was alone at the reception counter, organizing some papers and trying to distract myself with the heavy silence of the place. That's when the phone rang. The sound echoed through the empty corridor, making me jump in the chair. I attended quickly, hoping to be an emergency or perhaps a doctor needing information. On the other end of the line, I heard a weak voice, almost whispering, saying, "I need help. 4th, 214. The call was full of interference, as if the person was talking too far. Before I could ask something, the line fell. At first, I didn't think so much. Sometimes patients call the reception by mistake or not being able to trigger nursing. But something in that voice made me rest. It was strange, as if the person was afraid or suffering. I decided to check the system to see who was in room 214, but when I looked, the room was marked as empty for weeks. I was confused. Perhaps it was a system error or someone who had been transferred and the record was not updated. I decided to call the ward to confirm, but the nurse on duty assured me that the room was unoccupied and locked. She even played, saying that I should be tired and imagining things. But I knew what I had heard. About an hour later, the phone rang again. This time, my heart accelerated even before I attended. It was the same, even weaker, almost imperceptible voice. "Please, 4th 214. The static was so tall that I could barely understand, but the hopelessness in that voice was clear. Again, the call fell before I could answer. I stood there, holding the phone, trying to see what was going on. I decided I needed to check in person. I grabbed the lantern and the hospital's masters, since the room was locked, and began to walk the dark hallway toward 214. Each step was echoed, and the silence around me seemed suffocating. When I arrived at the room, the door was closed, as expected. I put the key in the lock, but before opening, I felt a strange cold, as if the air around me had suddenly cooled. I opened the door slowly, and the room was exactly as it should be. Empty, clean, with the beds and closed curtains. Nothing seemed out of the normal, but something in the environment made me extremely uncomfortable. I felt as if it were being observed, even knowing that there was no one there. I stood at the door for a few seconds, looking at the dark room, until a wave of fear made me back down and lock the door again. I went back to the reception, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad joke, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Back at the reception, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept going back to that voice and the empty room. I decided to call security, but the watchman said he had not seen anything strange and that the camera systems were working normally. He even laughed when I mentioned the calls, saying that I should be watching many horror movies, but I couldn't laugh. Something that night was making me increasingly disturbed. That's when the phone rang again. This time, I hesitated before attending, but the professional in me ended up taking the receiver. It was the same voice, but now it seemed closer, as if the person was speaking directly in my ear. "Why don't you help me? I'm here, room 214. The static was almost unbearable, and I felt a shiver through my spine. Before I could say anything, the call fell again. I couldn't take it anymore. I took the phone and called the ward again, asking someone to come to the reception. While waiting, I stared at the corridor leading to room 214, as if expecting to see something or someone showing up. The nurse arrived a few minutes later, and I explained everything that had happened. She looked skeptical, but agreed to come with me to the room to check. This time, when we opened the door, the room was exactly as before. Empty, silent, with no sign that someone had been there. The nurse shrugged and said it was probably just a problem on the telephone line or something. But I couldn't believe it. Something that night was out of normal, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that those calls were real, even if they didn't make sense. After the nurse left, I tried to convince myself that she was right. Perhaps it was just a technical problem, a short circuit in the line or something. But even so, I couldn't get rid of that feeling that something was wrong. I decided to keep the phone close to me, just by precaution. A few hours passed, and the hospital was strangely quiet. Even the usual sounds, such as the noise of the machines or the distant steps of the employees, seemed to have disappeared. It was then that the phone rang again. This time, I could hardly answer. My hands were shaking, and my stomach rapped. The voice on the other side was even weaker, almost a whisper. "Are you going to let me die here?" Static was so intense that I could barely hear, but the tone of despair was unmistakable. The call fell before I could answer, and I was sitting there, paralyzed, trying to understand what the hell was happening. I couldn't stand that anymore. I took the flashlight and the keys again and decided to go to the fourth 214 once more. This time, I didn't care about anyone. I wanted to see with my own eyes if there was anything there I had lost before. When I arrived home, the door was locked, as always, but something seemed different. The air around me was cold, and I could feel a strange pressure, as if the environment itself was pushing me away. I opened the door slowly, and the room was dark, but I swear I heard a whisper from inside. It was the same voice as the calls, but now it seemed to be in the room with me. My heart beat so hard that I thought I was going out of my chest. I pointed the flashlight to the darkest corner of the room, and for a second, I swear I saw a shadow moving. It was not a clear figure, but something that seemed to squirm and disappear in the dark. Without looking back, when I returned to the reception, I was shaking so much that I could barely sit down. I took the phone and called security again, insisting that something was wrong in room 214. This time, the watchman looked a little more worried, perhaps because of the tone of my voice. He said he would take a look, but I knew I wasn't going to advance. Something in that room was beyond what any of us could explain. While waiting, I stared at the hall, waiting to see something, anything, that could give me a clue of what was going on. But everything was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the sound of my own heart beating. The watchman arrived a few minutes later, and I took him to fourth 214. This time, when we opened the door, the room was completely normal. No shadows, no whispers, just the same empty and silent room as before. The watchman took a look around, checked the bathroom, and even looked under the beds, but found nothing. He looked at me with a little worried, half-incredulous expression and said that maybe I should go home and rest a little. I knew he didn't believe me, but I also knew I wasn't imagining things. Something that night had scared me in a way that I had never felt before. After the watchman left, I tried to calm down. I decided that if the phone rang again, I would just not answer. But of course he touched. This time, I could hardly look at the device. That sound seemed to echo in my head, as if I was calling me to something I didn't want to face. I answered, but said nothing. On the other side, the voice was clearer than ever, almost as if in the room with me. "You know I'm here. Why doesn't it come?" The static disappeared completely, and the voice sounded so real, so human, that I almost answered. But then something changed. The voice began to laugh, a low, hoarse laugh that made me feel a cold in my pimple. The call fell, and I sat there, holding the phone, trying to understand what had just happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I took my things and decided I was leaving. It didn't matter if I was going to lose my job or if anyone would think I was crazy. I needed to get out of there. As I walked down the corridors toward the exit, I felt like it was followed. I didn't hear steps, I didn't see anyone, but the feeling was so strong that I almost ran to the parking lot. When I finally got in my car and started the engine, I looked at the hospital for the last time. The lights of room 214 were lit. I swear they were. I stood there, looking at that bright window until the lights went out alone, as if someone had turned off the switch. I left as fast as I could and never returned to that shift of the night. The next day, I spoke to my supervisor about what happened. He heard carefully, but I knew he didn't believe me. He suggested that I took a few days off and maybe talk to someone about the stress of work. I didn't insist. I knew no one would believe it, and I was starting to doubt what I had lived myself. But one thing I knew: those calls, that voice, that feeling of being observed, all this had been real. I had no explanation, but I didn't need one either. Some things simply can't be explained. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I never received calls from room 214 again, and never entered that room again. Sometimes I still think of that voice and laugh, and I wonder if there was someone really needing help, or if it was much worse. The hospital continues to function normally, and no one else mentioned anything strange. But I know what I lived, and it will never get out of my head. To this day, when I pass a phone that plays at night, I feel a cold in my pimple and remember that voice whispering, "Why don't you help me?"